Okay, it's time. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown, and another week has passed, and we are back together again. At least that is if you are a returning listener. If you're new, welcome to you. I hope this is finding you well, and that your drive or your walk or your breakfast or whatever it is that you might be doing right now while you're listening to this is going well. There's no problems or annoyances, that maybe you're having a pleasant moment right now while this is hitting your ears. That would be very nice, and that is my hope to you. I myself am actually just a little bit under the weather, and I'm right up against it again this week. This is like one of these last-minute intros that I'm getting in just under the wire in time. That is because, like I said, I got a little bit sick a couple days ago, but I got well enough to have a workshop yesterday in Doylestown, Pennsylvania at Dragonfly Yoga. I want to give a big, fat shout out to Joe and Alexis and all the very fine people there. It really was an enjoyable time, and I felt an earnest inquiry into yoga and a shared experience that I'm very happy to have had. It dovetailed perfectly with the blog post that I put out this week. It's dropping the very same day that this podcast is. It's called The Future of Yoga is Small. And it became encapsulated, my ideas for this blog post, when I arrived to teach a workshop at Dragonfly Yoga in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. And I had difficulty locating it initially because from the outside, Dragonfly Yoga looks exactly like a home. It doesn't look like a storefront like I had in Brooklyn. It's like a quaint little house in a beautiful little neighborhood. Not unlike my friend Ryan's place, Bow Street Yoga in Boston, but something about that was exactly what I've been thinking about, that we've often talked about on this podcast, this idea that core power and yoga works and these scaled models are kind of taking over a lot of the market share, and will the independent sole proprietor centers still be able to survive in the face of that? That's in fact some of the topic of today's talk with Rexx Anthony, which I'll get to shortly. But I've been thinking more and more that it isn't even about just whether or not it's like VC backed or independently owned, because now that I'm out here, like just being a teacher and kind of seeing a little bit more, I feel like there's a lot of independent owned, operated yoga centers who employ the same models for their business as some of the larger scaled models do, or some of the techniques that have come about through the internet and the way that the internet is used to drive profits. Some of those techniques have been adopted by the yoga world, and it's understandable. Of course, you always look to models that are successful in other industries and adopt them to your own. That's not a weird thing to have happen, but those particular techniques, they are very good at accomplishing an immediate gain, but very often at the expense of like a longer term stability. And I think that's part of what's the problem with our country in general right now, maybe even the world, although I do think there are some countries on the planet that are working against that or working in a different direction than that. But this grow or die model and the techniques that are about showing like an immediate bump, but not always proving to be like, again, like fostering long-term relationships that make for stable communities. So in any case, I'm making a case for new models that we haven't even really tried yet. I'm sure it's happening in sectors that we don't get to hear about, but I think that the yoga world is probably a great place to experiment with subverting the paradigm. I like that, subverting the paradigm, you know? And the way that you do that is you manage to find a way to create yoga centers or yoga businesses that are genuinely not trying to get bigger, but just trying to find where they can serve and to serve well, and to do that in a way that is sustainable, whatever that means. I've already questioned, what does that mean, sustainable? But it, I think, has to do with what you aim for, you know? I think for a long time, at least myself, and I think I'm not the only one, there's this idea in the back of your head that if you create something, like when I created Abhyasa Yoga Center in Brooklyn, that it could grow and I could have more than one location, and, you know, I'm going to go to Try Yoga and I'm going to talk to the owner there. And, you know, that's a really interesting example as well. They've got like 5 locations, like just under like 200 teachers or something like that. And they're working really hard to make sure that they maintain depth of content and whatnot. But when you go that big, there's just certain things you have to contend with and certain relationships that are different. Like I write in my blog, the first time I ever registered for a yoga class, I was making change for myself in a cigar box at the front door, you know? And now buying yoga classes is like more like buying shit off Amazon or something, you know? And I have a wonderful woman who I don't know if she listens to the podcast. Her name is Mary Hudson. And Mary has been sub-editing my blog for me for years. She was a student of mine who was also a school teacher. She taught English. And every month I send her my blog, and she just like checks all my like grammar and spelling. But over the years, she's come to know my writing so well. Now she actually like makes editorial suggestions every once in a while. I almost take every suggestion she makes. And Mary moved to Italy not too long ago. And when I sent her my blog post this month and she read it, she told me this story about how she takes this yoga class every week where she lives in Italy. And every week after the class, everybody goes up to pay their whatever 10 euros for the class. And the teacher like never like has enough change. So there's always all this stuff that happens where like everybody's like going into their wallets and trying to come up with change and trying to figure out how everybody can pay for class. And every time it ends up happening, they find a way to make it happen. And it's totally inefficient. And I think like New Yorkers would be totally annoyed maybe, but there's all this human interaction that happens because of that. And that's what we've lost, and that's what's not good for yoga. Now, I'm not suggesting we're going to just give up all of our technology, although I do think it would be a good idea to disconnect more than we are. I'm just thinking that maybe there's a better balance. Maybe we can find ways to develop communities of practice that are viable from a like business standpoint, but don't have to employ $30 for 30 days and stuff like that to try to like convince people to come in. But there's an actual human interaction that involves a real exchange of value, and we get to directly experience it. So you can check out the blog post. It's on the website, and it's totally relevant to today's talk with Rexx Anthony from Rogue Ashtanga. He wrote a blog post a while back that was just talking about his experience of opening and closing yoga centers and offering up some ideas about how that might happen. I really appreciated it. As I think I said last week, I read it right when I was closing my place, and it resonated with me, so I reached out to him, and we have a really good talk from the grassroots insider perspective. We're going to listen to that today. Before we do, let me drop my stuff. I am going to be in London this weekend, January 12th through 14th at Tri-Yoga Camden. I am going to also be in Dow and Bern, Switzerland the following weekend, January 20th, 22nd. I am going to be in Armonk, New York, February 3rd. And I'm going to be in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, February 16th through 18th. I also want to announce that I am doing a sort of mini training. It's a 6-day intensive that happens over 2 weekends here in Easton at Easton Yoga. That is March 2nd through 4th and 9th through 11th. All of those events can be found along with the archives of this podcast and the blog I was mentioning and my online yoga video stuff, including my live stream subscription with 24-hour access. All of that stuff can be found at jbrownyoga.com. I want to thank everybody for all the emails I got this week after Shashan Korn episode telling me that it's okay if I want to get sponsors for the podcast, that you don't think I'm going to be a sellout. I really appreciate it. There was a lot of notes that came in, and that so many of you took a moment to express that kind of support. It really meant a lot to me. I don't really know what we're going to do yet, but I'll be letting you know. If you want to show some support for the podcast in other ways than sending me emails, you could go to a blog or podcast page and make a direct donation, or you could go to iTunes and write a review and give us some stars. I would appreciate it if you did that. Other than that, I'll touch base with you on the other side. And, oh yeah, maybe am I tipping the hat about the 100th episode? I don't know. Let me think about it. I'll let you know on the other side. For now, let's go ahead and listen to this talk I had with Rexx Anthony.
Hello?
Hello. Is this Rexx?
Yes, Jay. How are you?
I'm good, man. How are you?
Good.
What's going on?
Nothing much. Just enjoying a nice Friday afternoon.
Nice.
How about you?
I'm doing pretty good. Keep talking for me. I'm setting a level.
Okay. Sure. Yeah. So I'm actually just at the Washington Yoga Center right now, where I've been working for about 6 months.
Oh, so is that a place that you opened, or you just work there?
No, I just work here now. I'm working as a studio manager for the owner.
I see. Interesting. Yeah. Interesting. You got the skills, but now you don't have to have it all on your shoulders only.
Exactly.
All right. Well, that is actually a perfect beginning for us, because that's sort of where my initial interest to talk with you came, was that I felt a kindred spirit to you, because you posted this blog post called A Cautionary Tale on Operating Yoga Centers or Yoga Studios.
Yeah.
And you start off by saying that it's been a year since you closed your place. And that was posted right when I was in the midst of closing my place. Mm-hmm. And I was like, oh, this guy totally knows what's up. Yeah. I was like, this guy's clearly been in the same situation that I've been in. And you just kind of laid it out in clear terms.
Yeah.
And then, it's been a while. And then getting ready to talk to you, I was looking at sort of like your bio, and I was like, oh, wow, we have like more common than not, for sure. And so I guess first thing I would say is, how long after closing your center did you just like teach, or what did you do until now? Like, how soon before you took this gig managing?
So I continued to actually teach immediately after my studio closed. I was teaching a couple of corporate classes outside of the studio, and I continued to teach those, and had for a little while, after I took on a Mysore program about a month and a half after my studio closed at another local yoga studio, the Yoga District. So I did that, and
what was that like? What was it like to transition? Because I'm asking because that's kind of where I'm now. I'm like, I'm back in the wild world of independent teachers and centers, and it's been 10 years since I was here.
Yeah, so it's been interesting because, like you mentioned before, now that I'm, when I was just teaching independently, I didn't have any of the responsibility of, revenue or of getting subs for classes or, marketing the studio. It was just go in, teach my class, and then leave. And there was a certain amount of freedom to that, and I did teach independently for about 9 or 10 months. And in the interim time, I was also, a lot of other yoga studio owners in the area had kind of contacted me and wanted some advice on what they were going through. So I kind of did some informal consulting for them. And then I guess it was in June of this year, I decided that I just had kind of been completely burned out on teaching. So I've actually pulled back. I only teach 2 classes now a week. And aside from that, I've just been managing the studio. And it feels kind of like the right thing to do to give me some space to figure out what yoga is and what yoga means to me again.
Wow. It's so interesting to hear you say that because just before I got on with you, I'm trying to write this thing. And it's about how I feel like one of the things that's changed. There's a lot that's the same from 10 years ago when I was here. It's still just you show up to a room and there needs to be a clean floor and then you do breathing and moving. You know what I mean? There's still some basic things about a yoga class that will always remain the same, I feel like. But the sort of expectations of people who come and it seems like where value gets placed has changed a lot in the last 10 years. And I'm curious because I know from what I know of you that you started in yoga back in a time was around when I started, and it was a different thing at another time,
Yeah, it has changed a lot.
And I'm curious, because I know. All right, well, let's go back to where it starts. So I know from your bio that you and I both had our first yoga class in a theater program. Is that right?
Yeah, it was I was in theater at the University of Kentucky and was in a theater movement / dance class. And my first class was a Shivananda yoga class, the 12 postures and then the final relaxation.
Was it where you do the shavasana in between with the eye rolls and everything?
I don't remember that so much. I just remember the first time I tried headstand, and I was just like, what is this?
It is pretty crazy if you've never tried to go upside down before, and then you do. It's a new orientation.
Yeah.
All right, so you're in your theater programs, as was I, was part of the movement. But I do remember the yoga for me standing out from some of the other movement forms. There was something about it that was different.
Right. I mean, I was into a lot of French experimental theater and also Polish experimental theater artists.
Like Grotowski and stuff?
Grotowski, exactly.
See, I started at Playwrights Horizons Theater School and was all Stanislavski, marking beats on your script and everything. Mm-hmm. And then I got totally disenchanted and switched to the experimental theater wing and rolled around on the floor and did Grotowski work. Yeah. So I know. All right. So you were in that realm.
Yeah.
All right. And so what was your experience of yoga in that context?
So for me, it was kind of, I mean, it was, in some ways, it was a very practical experience of everything that I had been reading about in, Grotowski's work, Toward the Poor Theater, And one of his major actors, Rizard Cieslak, was always demonstrating the posture or demonstrating those yoga postures in pictures that I saw of his experimental work. So I was really intrigued by that. And at the same time, I was reading quite a bit of Eastern philosophy, so I'd started reading Alan Watts and works on Buddhism, a lot of Zen Buddhism, and then later on a little bit more Tibetan Buddhism, Taoism. And so I was reading all of this stuff as well, and it just seemed like a natural fit. Well, if I'm going to do experimental theater, I might as well, try practicing yoga and see what they're talking about. And at the time, I'd also been doing a lot of weightlifting and gymnastics, and I was kind of splitting my time between those two pursuits, and just ended up pursuing a lot more yoga as time went on. So I would oftentimes, like when I was in theater productions, I would oftentimes show up like an hour before the production, before I had to get ready, get in costume and get ready, put on makeup and everything. And I would just practice. It wasn't anything very structured. It was, maybe some standing postures, back bends, pretty much just riffing off of what I had studied in the Shivananda books. And the thing I remember is that, because I'm like 18, 19 when this is happening, and I remember not owning a yoga mat for like almost a year and a half. And I just practiced on like the hardwood floors. And I think nowadays, now it's like, oh, I've got to have a manduka mat, and I've got to have, blankets and everything for shoulder stands. So it's interesting to see kind of the changes that I've gone through in my own practice from, starting, in around 19 to now. So.
Well, we really did like kind of start in the same place, and interesting because I don't always think of my yoga practice starting there, but like you, I was a theater kid, and I always showed up an hour early and warmed up, did movement warm up always, and it was that time, like just like with myself in that space, doing whatever I thought to do to get ready, like that was the precursor of my yoga practice. And in fact, one of the reasons I had decided to like leave performance as like my thing, was that I always enjoyed like the rehearsal process in a way more than the performing. Like I enjoyed having to go to rehearsals and being in those spaces, but the performing was always about like some kind of external approval for me that I kind of needed to get away from.
Yeah.
And I also felt like for me, yoga came in because acting training, at least my initial acting training, which wasn't Grotowski, where it was like this other stuff, but it was all about like tearing me down in a way. Like it tore down all my bullshit kid stuff, and like left me like this emotional pool on the floor, but I wasn't very functional there. Like it didn't do anything to pick me up or build me up or help me create anything. And yoga practice kind of became the venue for me to kind of build what I wanted to be or who I wanted to be more, All right, so you, like me, we had these early experiences, and so when do you graduate?
I graduated in 2002.
Okay. And then have you started attending more formal yoga classes before you graduate?
Yeah, so it was kind of a confluence of events. I was taking these elective gymnastics classes at the university. So I was learning very basic like floor movements and some apparatus work, and I was also looking for something a little bit more formalized with the yoga. And it just so happened that there was an Ashtanga teacher who was teaching out of a dance studio, and his name is Dean Holt. I don't know if I haven't seen him in probably about, 10 or 11 years. But I remember showing up for my very first class, and it was a Sunday morning, and he had me come in, he explained to me the concept of the breathing and the movement, and then he had me do sun salutations A for like 10 minutes, nonstop, sun salutations B for 10 times, and then had me stop after that, sit down, take Padmasana, do the final breathing exercise, final 3 exercises or final 3 postures from Ashtanga, and then he had me take rest. And he said, you can sit and watch if you want, and that's that. And that's really, he was very old. I really liked him because he was very old school in how he taught it. He taught it one posture at a time. He didn't rush me through anything.
How long did you just stay with that? Like, did you come back the next day, or like?
Yeah.
And you went back the next day, and did he have you do the same thing? Like, how long did he keep you there before he let you move on? Like, how did that process go? I think that's interesting. That is the sort of old school way, as I understand it. Back in the day when you were taught Ashtanga, you didn't do full primary series right like the first time you showed up. Like, it got taught to you in like stages.
Well, yeah, and there was, at the time too, there weren't a lot of different yoga styles out, that were well known. It was, I think I went to maybe 1 or 2 Kundalini yoga classes and didn't really care for it. And then there was Shivananda
and Iyengar for a while, but Ashtanga was a little bit late on the scene. But once it hit the scene, it hit the scene big time. Like, that's what all the gyms picked up, and it kind of took off. We've talked about that on the podcast a lot, like when Ashtanga, Patabi Joyce made his first trips over here, and it just it kind of spread like wildfire.
Right. And there was the whole power yoga movement coming up as well.
Which was up your alley, because you were already doing like pretty athletic kind of gymnastic stuff in other areas too.
Right. And so that was always kind of the funny thing was, especially as I got more into the primary series and I'm doing the jump backs and the jump throughs, people would ask me sometimes after class, oh, how did you learn that? I'm like, well, I did take some gymnastics, which gave me some of the strength, but, so there was a little bit of an edge there, but I pretty much, I'm pretty much of like a person that likes to dig really deep into one particular area before I move on. And so I said, okay, I'm going to try this Ashtanga thing for 6 months, 7 months, maybe a year, and see how it goes. And, Dean taught me, he didn't teach me rapidly, but he would always have me come in and just do what I remembered, and then would correct me on a few things here and there. And if he felt like he could add another posture on, then he would do that. And, I think I learned the primary series. I finally completed the entire primary series in like 9 or 10 months.
And see, in that instance, like, he's not leading you. You have to remember it.
Oh, yeah.
There's not like a lead class to follow. You have to know it or not, right?
Yeah, and so I was practicing only once a week with him in the studio, and then the other days of the week, I was practicing at my apartment in the college campus, and so I really liked that element of okay, I'm going to learn a little bit now, but then I'm going to practice, at home, what I remember, and I think I got David Swinson's Ashtanga Yoga manual. And there was another book that was out called Dynamic Yoga that was kind of Ashtanga based, and I just used those to kind of use as reference. But I just felt happy to keep plugging away with what I was doing.
Well, that's one of the things I always liked about Ashtanga, and have still carried through in my own practice, even after kind of leaving that school, is that it had like these set sequences. You could learn them and know them and do them on your own, and it was like it's a self-practice tradition,
Yeah, and I also studied some Iyengar yoga, which was also in line with that as well. With the take class once a week and then practice by yourself. So,
well, it's interesting because I know I started this by saying, things have changed, and I feel like that's a little bit what I'm getting at, that things have changed in the sense that I don't know, like back when I first started going to yoga classes, the people who were there seemed to all be these kind of like ragtag seekers or something, you know? It wasn't so much like you came to buy it, you know, like you didn't, I think to feel like you really had to earn that. You had to show up every day and learn it. You know what I mean? Like he wasn't trying to please you.
Yeah, and there definitely wasn't, I don't think yoga studios really weren't doing as much big business back then as they are now. I mean, now a lot of people can get certified. They can get their 200, 500 hours in, you know, a year, maybe 2 years. And then they're off running a studio after that. And, you know, to me, that was just, I mean, I you know, having gone through owning a studio and closing one, you know, I did not feel prepared. I would not feel prepared to have, you know, to only have a year or two under my belt of, you know, of teaching to then decide to open a studio.
Well, I agree. I think you want to have more under your belt than that if you're going to take it on. But it's just interesting to me because when you were studying, you know, with Dean in the Ashtanga world, and even still, there isn't like 200-hour trainings. It was just Patavi like gave you the nod. You know, that was the way. That was the way you got your credential. You know.
And it was, you know, there wasn't as much information. You know, the internet really wasn't a source of information yet for a lot of, you know, yoga practice. And really, you know, there was more about the whole, you know, it was all about the community and learning it, you know, practicing it with other people. You know, yes, you paid your dues, but, you know, the biggest goal I think that I ever had when I was that age was, well, I want to go to Mysore at some point and practice this.
And did you?
So actually, I did not. I've never been.
You never made it there, Mr. Rogue Ashtanga?
I've never made it to Mysore, and you know, so that kind of has always been, I think, a little bit of a hindrance to me when I teach Mysore.
Well, you know what though, if it's any consolation, I went to India once in my life for 3 months many years ago, and I was in Mysore, and we went to the Shala, but when we got there, frankly, there was so many Westerners out front, we didn't go in. Like, we had been traveling for months in, like, all these obscure places, and we just thought, oh, I don't want to do that. We'd been meeting all these, like, random swamis and teachers, you know what I mean? And then it was like a scene. It was like, it felt like New York. A little touch of New York right there in Mysore, when we showed up there. So it might not have been all as much as you thought it was going to be, you know?
Well, and that's what I kind of gathered as, you know, every time I tried to go to Mysore, and I, you know, planned it 3 times. And the first time I ended up having to get surgery. So that kind of knocked me out of practice for a couple months. And
was it practice related?
I think so. You know, there was a pre-existing condition there from when I was born. So it was a inguinal hernia. And you know, ended up having a recurrence of that from when I was born. Had the surgery, you know, healed up after 2 months, 3 months, and started practicing again. But I was doing some light stuff, some stretching and things like that, and very mild practice while I was healing, but definitely not primary series. And so the first time I tried to go to Mysore, that ended up not happening. Second time, I ended up having to stay in university a little bit longer. So when I moved to D.C., I started going to American in order to study for medical school. And you know, I was getting my prerequisites, all these bio and chemistry and physics, and you know, the last semester, I'm like, okay, I'm going to finally be done, and before I go off to school, I want to go to Mysore for a couple of months, and, you know, because it's going to be a long haul after that. And they then tell me, well, you actually have to take one more course before you can graduate. So I was like, okay.
Strike two.
Strike two. And then strike three was in May of 2009 when Patavi passed. And It was just like, well, I don't know now. I mean, to me, a lot of it was, going to Mysore was going to be study with Patavi Joyce, and it just kind of, my interest in it kind of faded a little bit after that. And, but I continue to practice. So.
Yeah, all right. Well, let's go back to your earlier practice. So your dean gets you through primary series, you said in like 9 months or something.
Yep.
And then once you're doing full primary, you're just off and running. Are you super regular? Do you do like 6 days a week, no moon days, like strict like?
No. I was definitely like hardcore on it. So I was doing 6 days a week. I was taking moon days off.
Yeah.
I was practicing pretty consistently. Dean did not take me to intermediate. I didn't get introduced to intermediate until I moved to DC.
Mm-hmm.
So,
all right. Well, so you moved to DC. You're already roaring on an Ashtanga practice, and who you start studying with there?
David Ingalls had the Ashtanga Yoga Center, which was really the only Ashtanga Yoga Center in DC. So now I think there are now 5 or 6 Mysore programs in DC. But it used to be that there was only one place you could practice, and it was the Ashtanga Yoga Center. So,
and that's where you went.
Yeah.
And so you start moving on to second series and stuff.
Yeah, and the funny thing, is that every time that I've looked at moving someplace, like whether it's, for school or somewhere else, once I got hooked on Ashtanga, I would always look, does this city have Ashtanga? Does it have an Ashtanga Yoga Center? I always felt like I needed to have that kind of that option available. So David introduced me to intermediate. He cleaned up a little bit of my primary series, and then introduced me to intermediate. And he was also a bit old school as well, in the sense that he was having me do, full primary and then whatever part of intermediate all the way up until Karandavasana. And I just remember at the time I was also going to the classes in chemistry. I had an 8 a.m. chemistry class. So I always had to make sure that I got out on time. And I was doing these 2.5 hour long practices. And I was just falling asleep during chemistry so often. So, I had some teachers who really kicked my butt, and I guess I needed it. So.
Well, I don't know. That might be debatable, but it's interesting because that was, back then, and I've talked about this on the podcast before, when you went to like a straight up Ashtanga practice, like Mysore style like that, it was like hardcore, like it just seemed like, I don't know how it was where you were going, if they were teaching, in a very traditional way, but if you couldn't do stuff, you were in the back of the room. The assists were like, they were really getting you into that. There was the kind of strong assists that they do back then are kind of frowned upon a little bit right now. Even Eddie Stern mentioned that when he came on, that they've kind of moved away from some of those things that they used to do back then.
Yeah. And they even, they even, when they called them adjustments, I remember people in the Jiva Mukti community always calling them assists as opposed to adjustments, because you get your car adjusted, right? This is kind of the common way to explain it. But the adjustments were quite strong, and for the most part, I didn't really need any of the really torturous adjustments like in Marichasana D or Supta Karmasana. I was already pretty flexible. I'm very flexible in my shoulders, and my hips have been reasonably flexible as well.
Right. If you can already do stuff, then you don't have to get cranked into stuff as much. Right?
Yeah. But like, I mean, the other end of that though is that because I was flexible, you know, teachers would be interested in, you know, pushing me a little bit more and seeing how far I can go. And so, you know, there was that time where I was working actively on trying to grab my ankles or walk them up to my calves. And I remember feeling muscles in my ribs popping and snapping. And it's just like, I don't think this is going to be something I should be doing long term. So,
what were we doing, man? I did some of that stuff too. What were we doing? Why were we doing that stuff?
I have no idea.
We were encouraged, though. That's the thing, you know? Like, it wasn't just us deciding to do that. People were like, hey, do this. And we're like, okay.
Yeah. Like you're in your 20s. You're like, okay, sure, whatever. And you try to do it, and then you feel these weird sounds and hear these weird sounds. And
I know. I just chalked it all up to opening. I'm just opening.
Yes, openings, yes. Yeah, that's...
Yeah, we reckon with all that opening now, don't we?
Yeah. What is it? I think Patabi Joyce used to say, when someone would say they were, you know, in pain or something, he would say, well, if it's open, it'll now stay open. You know, it's like...
Some things you don't want to open, like your knees.
Yeah.
They want to stay intact, those knees. All right, well, listen, let's wait before we go all the way there. I want to hear a little bit about when you started teaching. So how long are you doing practice before you start to teach other people practice?
So I started teaching when I was 22, 23. So I pretty much started teaching out the gate, which... You know, it's. I don't necessarily. I mean, nowadays I don't think it's a good idea, but you know, it's what worked for me at the time.
Me too. I could do stuff, and so like within a year and a half, maybe 2 years, I practiced, and then I started teaching privately. But I started taking on classes pretty soon.
Yeah, I was teaching at like the YMCA and you know some gym.
That was my first group class. Was a YMCA.
Yeah. My first class was really interesting. I had 2 mounted police women who were my first students, and they were so into it that they decided to bring their whole like squad of policemen with them as well. And so I had like 80% of my first yoga class was the Lexington, Kentucky Mounted Police Department. So I always like laughed at that because I felt like this is a very unusual situation.
And were you teaching them Ashtanga?
So okay, little confession here. So I didn't know what to teach. I didn't know, you know, what I should teach, what would be considered, you know. I think I remember thinking to myself, well, Ashtanga might be too hard, so maybe I should find, you know, something else to teach them or some sort of variation. And so I started looking at all the old Gayam videos on VHS.
Nice.
So, and I was...
you dated yourself with the VHS, man. Some people don't even know what that is, maybe.
Yeah, I definitely remember VHS and laser discs and cassette tapes. But,
all right, so what was the one that you used?
Yeah, so the one I finally settled upon was Rodney Yee's. It was like, I think it was his Power Yoga or something like that. Mm-hmm. So I basically, you know, sat down, watched that video, wrote it all out, and then started teaching that sequence or a variation of it, because some of the stuff wasn't going to be appropriate for the students. But I just started teaching that and used that as a template to teach. And
nice. You're not the only one. There's been a number of people who cite Rodney's videos as their initial teaching sources. But it worked out. They liked the class. They came back and brought the rest of their crew.
Exactly.
Okay. So you're teaching, you're moonlighting as like a Rodney Yee student at the Y, but you're still practicing Ashtanga yourself.
Yeah, I was still practicing Ashtanga myself, and every now and then I would maybe teach them like part of primary as just, you know, a one-off, you know, just to introduce them to it. But I would try to use other people's sequences. I would practice the sequence myself beforehand, but I would use other people's sequences because I felt like it was a little bit more, it was more accessible to people. With Ashtanga, I always worried, if they can't jump back or they can't jump through, they're going to get frustrated and they're going to see other people doing it. And
that definitely happened to me too. I had learned those forms and started teaching, and then at a certain point came up against the same thing. Like it was limiting. Like there was only a certain types of people who could do that stuff.
Yeah.
But you also at some point started to teach Ashtanga as well, right?
Yeah. So after probably a year or two, I started teaching more of Ashtanga-based classes.
And did you get like gigs at centers now? Did you branch out from the Y? Like where were you teaching these Ashtanga classes?
So the first Ashtanga class, formal Ashtanga class I taught was at Flow Yoga Center in like 2004, I think.
And that was lead?
That was lead, purely lead. And I did that for about a year and a half or so. And at the same time I was teaching, I was doing the whole itinerant teacher gig. I was, going from a yoga studio to a gym, teaching morning classes, teaching evening classes, trying to get corporate classes during lunchtime hours.
Maybe you snag like a private or two here or there.
Yeah, privates, So I was doing that for about 4 or 5 years. And at the same time I was, in school doing all these pre-medical courses, and then ended up getting into school and, moved to Chicago, and then stopped teaching really for all intensive purposes for about a year. And then at that point there was some family issues that came up that, kind of distracted me from coursework, and I ended up moving back to DC. And that's when I got involved with the yoga center that I eventually started managing for and directing. And that became it was only going to be like a year-long gig is what I initially did. But I then ended up staying for 6 years.
And so were you teaching and managing that center?
Yeah, so I was teaching, I was managing it. And, the reason also why I ended up staying was because I ended up marrying the woman who owned it.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.